So what is the history of disability? Well, that is a big question, and it's not something we can answer easily. So I'm going to show you my kind of like top kind of significant events in history. Again, very subjective, but hopefully will give you a nice insight about the struggles and troubles and turbilations that it has taken for us to get to where we are today. Not perfect, but definitely a lot better than where we were. My name's Nat, and I am the head of community, that's right, at Exceptional Individuals. And we support people who are neurodiverse. So for those of you who do not know, neurodiverse or neurodivergent typically refers to conditions like dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, essentially any way which is a different way of thinking or processing the world compared to the majority of the population. Now, you could argue about, how does neurodiversity fit in with disability? Well, some may argue it is inherent, it is a disability, and the Equality Act would also back that up. Other people would argue it's only disabling due to society and isn't itself a disability. And others would say, well, though I don't consider it to be a disability, the likelihood of having another co-occurring condition or comorbidity is really high. So they kind of go together, whether or not you like it or not. So those are some of the subjects we're going to be looking at today. Now, to tell you a bit more about myself, I am dyslexic, dyspraxic, autistic, and I have OCD. So I'm neurodivergent. And throughout my life, I don't know if they should be separated, you tell me, but I've always been attending like disability groups, support networks. I'd always kind of get put in that category. And though I would say I didn't resonate with that category for many years, after learning the history and understanding the troubles and the difficulties that individuals have faced, I understand, I think, why people do that, because ultimately these groups aren't about the particular condition. They're normally about the empathy and the understanding and having a support network where you feel supported. Oh, Amy says, I'm working in a museum on a project to uncover and tell more disabled/disability stories for our audiences. I myself have a physical disability. Well, thanks for sharing it, Amy, and appreciate it. Now, as I said, typically we specialize in dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD. However, today we're going to put that on a bit of a spin and look at disability as a whole. Why? Because a lot of the people we support also have a physical disability as well. Is there a connection? Well, depending where you look, because for instance, like dyslexia and autism is a developmental condition, meaning you typically are born with it or it's in very early development. However, you can get something which is called acquired neurodiversity. So acquired autism, acquired dyslexia, and that could be related to, say, a head injury or like some sort of accident, which gives you the same characteristics and symptoms of the neurological condition without having it being part of your natural development. And a lot of the time, say people with epilepsy or people who have seizures, they might unfortunately, though it's a neurological based part, they end up falling over quite a lot. And then, you can see how it's all kind of entwined. You can't really separate the two. As much as some of us may want to, you can't. Now, as I said, this is our lovely team. What makes our team unique is that we're 80% neurodiverse. We have a wide range of teams with all sorts of abilities, disabilities, different ways of processing the world. And we like to help people. So these sessions are free or very low cost. And with the support, we then help people in the community. So it's a nice model, you're doing what you're doing good today. Now, every week we do deliver these webinars on all different subjects, and we do upload them to YouTube. So our last one was Jobs for Dyslexics. And this was an interactive webinar where we looked at the type of roles which are best suited for people who have certain ways of processing the world. Do check out our YouTube channel if you're interested in like other content and other things that we have gotten up to. So let's get to it, a brief history of disabilities. And I'm sure you can all appreciate I had to be very selective in what I chose to include and not include. By not including something, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying I was time limited, and these were things which were my personal selection of what I thought played a significant part in the journey that us as a society has been going on. Oh, Seha, again, apologies if I mispronounce your names. It really isn't intentional. Oh yeah, has said, hi, I am waiting for a list of ADHD and autism. I have just filed domestic abuse because of my parents and my grandfather. Oh dear, I am so sorry to hear that. But, no, there is no but. However, we are here to support you. So, quick question to start this going. What do you count as a disability? In your own kind of words or opinions, or maybe you just want to start putting some labels out there, where do you think we start the line and where we draw the line? Now, I put this kind of funny little GIF on here just because I think it challenges what some of society kind of connects disability to. And it's a really difficult one because, for instance, when people talk about neurodiversity, people often mention, well, is it a disability? And some people will say yes, other people say no. From a legal standpoint, it is, and that's a good thing. From a personal standpoint, I think it depends on you as an individual. I don't like the word disability. I agree with you. What would you like to call it instead? Oh, I think superpower. Just because you're different, you shouldn't be treated differently. Do you know what? I'm going to challenge you on that, okay? Because though superpower is really empowering, right? And I get that, I don't like it being called a superpower personally. And I'll tell you why, because for me, it underplays the fact that the struggle is challenging, it is real. Like being disabled, sorry for using that word, we're still coming up with a better word. Yes, there are strengths, there are pros, there are superpowers, definitely. But I don't want people to kind of think, okay, well, if it's such an ability, I don't need to support you. The support is still very much needed. But I'd love to take all of your hot take on that. Any condition or way of being that keeps you from functioning, however, disability depends on lack of accommodation. Yes, I like that one as well. I like to think in an ideal world when accommodations and adjustments have been put in place, maybe disabilities wouldn't necessarily have to be a thing. Amy says, I think it's a very individualized thing. Completely agree with you. And it often depends where you are on your journey. Of course, I struggle so much with depression and anxiety. Yeah, so things like that, you could argue, okay, depression, it sucks. It really does. But when you aren't feeling that depression, you feel so much more gratitude for life and you kind of take every day and you really cherish it. So it is kind of swings and roundabouts. And I think maybe the answer more depends on what day you ask. Amy says, for example, my friend and myself, who both have the same condition, don't see disability in the same way. Again, that's a really excellent point. Or Andrew says, it is challenging as some people like myself are proud of being disabled. Others are not. We need to respect each other's experiences. Completely. When I do talks, I naturally am very empowered and passionate about being neurodiverse. But then when I hear some people who have been discriminated against, have lost their jobs because of it, can't find employment, can you blame them for not, kind of admiring it or kind of seeing it as a strength? You can't really. So it is very situational. April says, I have autism. When I was younger, I didn't like being called disabled. More recently, I learned that autism is a hidden disability and accept myself as a disabled person more. I'm the same with you, April. I never liked being called disabled because I think it is kind of a very loaded word. However, in my later life, I appreciate it some more because though the label does have a lot of weight attached to it, it does mean I'm entitled to support and the Equality Act in the UK at least. So there are positives that come with it. Oh, Amy says, I agree with Andrew in some disability aspects. I have been made to feel bad that I'm not happy to be disabled. Yeah, and that's the thing, like, oh, you're ungrateful, or you're not helping the cause. There are no consensus. I would much rather not be disabled, and I have been ridiculed by other disabled people for saying that. And I think that's your right too. Sometimes Okay, are you making the best situation out of the cards you were dealt with? I mean, it's really difficult. Being on the journey I've been on, if I could click my fingers and take away my challenges, would I? The vast majority, no, because they have made me who I am. But there are some, like my OCD, I would get rid of in a heartbeat, but I would never get rid of my autism or dyslexia. However, I wouldn't expect someone with the exact same conditions as me to have the same opinion. These opinions are really great, everyone. Okay, well, I was diagnosed with social anxiety and depression growing up. Emotional abuse, it was difficult. I was bullied so much growing up. I feel so embarrassed that I wasn't normal. Unfortunately, that is a feeling that a lot of us feel. Adolescence is awful. And there is no thing as normal. Everyone has their own version of it. Yeah. And you could say, if you have anxiety, are you disabled? If you have a bad family life, are you disabled? If you have bad teachers, are you disabled? If disability is anything that puts you at a disadvantage compared to the majority of the population, then that definition could grow really large. Anyway, what counts as disability? Other neurodivergences, physical disabilities, experiences, personal mental health, impairments, autism, dyslexia, ADHD. You know, the list kind of, it's hard, isn't it, to really grasp onto it. And I think it's a very personal thing. If you feel that for whatever reason, you are at an inherent disability, you are at an inherent disadvantage, which you don't believe is your fault or you didn't contribute to it, maybe that's being disabled. But then again, you could argue, okay, well, if you're like, you don't look where you're crossing, you get hit by a car and you become disabled, well, no, you still are. We don't have a firm definition, or at least one which I think everyone can agree on. Andrew says it depends on how it affects you functionally in society. Yes, that's another good one. If you live in a society which is really progressive, maybe it's not so much of an issue. If you live in a society which is still developing and kind of learning, it's different. Like say you're in a wheelchair, if you're in a place which isn't kind of catered towards that, you are quite disabled because you can't have the independence. If you live in a place which has all like ramps and lifts, are you in a wheelchair? Yeah, you're still in a wheelchair, but you're able to navigate the world and access it like other people would. Oh, I think people need to be more educated on mental health, especially in my disorder. I am ethnic minority, British Pakistani. Unfortunately, you are right. In Asian communities in the UK, well, all Asian communities, from my experience, my partner's Asian, but I know that doesn't class me to make these rash opinions, but mental health is severely stigmatized. It is a thing. People still think depression is caused because someone has cursed you. Okay, that is very, very backwards. But you're right. So moving on a little bit, why is the history of disability important? Why do we even care? You know, history is a bleak place to be in. What is the importance of getting to grips with it, understanding it, teaching it to people, making sure that everyone has a knowledge of the journey we've come on? Should we be more focused on the present? Is the past no longer important? Is the future where our head should be? You tell me. Again, there isn't really a right answer here, though I have my opinion. The answer is very individual. I know it sounds silly, but as a left-handed person, I feel disabled and I live in a world organized in a right-handed people. You know, that's not silly. That's actually a really interesting point. If the world is designed for right-handed people, are you disabled for being left-handed? I would say yes, but everything is on a spectrum, because if you have left-handed scissors, no deal. If you only have right-handed scissors, things are going to take you a little bit longer. You're going to be a little bit slower. You're going to be at a bit more of a disadvantage. It's a really interesting one. And I think that does correlate to a lot on how people with dyslexia often feel, right? Because let's be honest, it's not the worst disability in the world. You can still function, you know, it puts you at a disadvantage in everything you do, but it's not as severe as some of the others. So you might feel this kind of imposter syndrome on kind of attaching yourself to the label of disabled because you feel that maybe you don't deserve it, or it kind of undermines other people's experiences. We've got to make people aware of how its perceptions have changed over times, so non-disabled people can understand different life perspectives. Representation, absolutely. You know, there's this classic thing which goes, if we don't remember the past, we are destined to repeat it. We have come a long way. When I'm teaching offices and workplaces around inclusion and diversity, they sometimes think, you know, are we just being a little bit over the top now? Absolutely not, because every time we kind of drop our standards, even for a second, these things can spiral. We often think that history is continuously getting better, but no, that is no guarantee. Things go up and down. We've had moments in history where the world has been really supportive of people like us. And then there's been moments afterwards where we have been ridiculed and persecuted and killed because of it. It's not a linear path. We've got finding tools for left-handed people is not always available. However, you're correct. Being left-handed is not that much of an issue. I think it depends on where you work as well. Imagine if you work in like a scissor factory, I don't know, and the only things available are right-handers. Then that's quite a disability. But if you don't ever do anything and you're just like left-handed, my handwriting is awful. I would say that puts me at a disadvantage. I think I broke the circle of intergenerational trauma. That's great. When you know the history, you can figure out differences, perspectives and approaches to do things better. It's very hard to try and change your family's mindset if they don't want to listen. That is, and I think the best thing you can do is change your own opinion and be consistent in your message. But if you're trying to change other people's minds, you might be disappointed, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily try. Thank you. Honestly, this group is so interactive and I love it. So here are some questions to all of you. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of them are probably aimed at people who don't have direct experience with disability, which most of you do, but they're still interesting questions to ask anyway. Well, we've got sometimes in universities, only desks for right-handed people. Yeah, do you know what? People just don't have that thing. I don't think it's intentional because like when you're creating something, you don't always think about all the, oh, what about this person? What about that person? It's really interesting. I don't know what I am. I am right-handed typically, but I'm left-handed for other things. I'm not ambidextrous. So for instance, I can't swap between the two, but I'll like eat I'll eat with like my left hand. I'll do archery with my left hand. It's kind of interesting, but it's very, very common in neurodivergent individuals. All right, what we've got here. I have negative attitudes towards people with health problems. A lot of you disagree. That is great to hear. But there's this thing called unconscious bias, which unfortunately, a lot of people do have negative opinions towards people with health problems and disabilities. It sucks. And they might not overtly tell you. I'm not saying they're on the street saying like curse words, but it's something in the back of their mind. We also got, when I am not able to do something as good as others, I am disabled. And this is again, is, you know, for some person who say is unable to walk and talk or, you know, are deaf or mute, if someone who is left-handed or dyslexic says they are disabled, do you think they'd be okay with that? I don't know. And because everyone could say that they are disabled in some way or another. And the spectrum is so huge. Is there a cutoff point where we're like, well, you have to be this much as disabled in order to be able to reap the benefits? So for instance, a parking space, extra benefits, additional time. As a dyslexic, I get 30 minutes extra in my exams and I am very, very grateful for it. But there's someone else who doesn't have dyslexia but has the same challenges as me, does not get 30 minutes extra time. It's really like challenging where to draw the line. Then we got, when I see someone else who is less able, I think of them in a negative way, very similar to the first one. Unfortunately, a lot of people feel that way. I use words such as, apologies for the language, cripple, mad, odd, and everyday language. Again, I'm preaching to the converted today, so I'm not expecting that to be the case, but I know people who still use the word cripple all the time. And that word is very loaded. I don't like saying it, it sounds awful. But when we look at history, it wasn't a slur. It was an official word that governments would use, that policies would use. And it's interesting how words change over time. The reason I use the word neurodiversity so much is because I don't like the word like learning disability, because I think it has too many like negatives attached to it. But time changes. The reason we don't use Asperger's as much anymore is because of the connotations back to like World War II. And also it doesn't really, it leaves people out of the journey. In terms of the comments, Amy just says, I think about when people are less able to do things, I may think about them in a negative way, simply because of the fact that I look upon my own self and my own struggles in a negative way. Thanks for sharing that, Amy. That's really interesting. Lazy, stupid, retarded. I said that word because it is horrible, but unfortunately people do use it. And some of the few I have been called by people. Yeah, I mean, when you look up the definition of what it means to be mentally retarded, actually a lot of us are. But the word is so vulgar, isn't it? It has such horrible attachments to it. And I think sometimes words are never meant to have negative intent, but if they are used so negatively, they kind of adopt that meaning. You know, when you look at like different races, there are so many slurs for different races, and some of them are just because people used it in that way, which then means they kind of became that way. Oh, Andrew says, however, the use of some of these words associated with the disability pride movement. See, and that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Like, we can reclaim words. Is that something that has a disability movement done that much at the moment? I know when it comes to race and LGBT, there are words which were seen as quite negative, which have since been taken back. Are we doing the same thing? Yes, in Pangal, which means mad. Yeah, I saw that. It's interesting that disabled, like, it has such, the words are rooted in discrimination. So, an absolute ledge, Robert M. Hensel, says there is no greater disability in society than the ability to see a person as more. This person has the Guinness Book World Record of the longest wheelie in a wheelchair. What a cool guy. Very inspirational. Oh, April says the original version of the Black Eyed Peas song, Let's Get It Started, has the R word in it. I'm glad they changed it, as the original song wouldn't age well today. I agree with you, April, because, for instance, like, people start singing it and then they start using it in everyday language. These words are powerful and the right context is important. Anyway, now I'm going to go over some quick history 101. What's been happening in the last 100 years? I read that retarded is a medical term, though it is. And this is something which, well, it was. I mean, depending on what kind of medical book you go to, a lot of them have been phased out, but they still are. For me personally, I don't care about if it's official or not official. It's all about the intent. Was the word used in order to offend me? If so, not cool. If it was used in a medical capacity in the right setting, maybe I'll be okay with it. I think personally, you shouldn't use the word just because of the attachment it has. But again, that's just my opinion. Well, let's go right back to the Greeks. In ancient Greece, they were obsessed with perfection. You know, when you see like the idea of a statue, you always see them like completely ripped, normally naked, a tiny leaf if you're lucky, really muscly arms. They wanted the body to be perfect. If it wasn't pristine, you were obsolete. How often do you look back in history or go to museums and you see someone with a disability who has been carved out of marble? You never do. It just isn't a thing. Then follow on with the Roman Empire, which was very influential, particularly in the UK. All of Europe, actually. There was no Latin word for disabled, so the Romans used the word monstrum, which was the word used for mythical monster. Great. So the word basically disabled originated from monster. Well, you can see how this can take quite some time to shake off. Oh, Amy says there's a really amazing statue/sculpture in the Sheffield Museum of a couple embracing both who have their limbs different/limbs lost. That's interesting. I'd love to see an image of that. After the fall of Rome, Christianity rose like a phoenix. Actually, no, I think a phoenix would have to be alive originally. But anyway, Christianity rose. And this was a time of sympathy towards people with disabled. Christianity was about love, harmony, working together, and people were very much pitied and charitable. However, at least someone's paying attention. Then, moving along sharply, we're in the Middle Ages, and those born with disabilities were considered evil. So, yes, the Christians may have helped a lot, but now evil. Evil and disability was the work of the devil, a punishment for sins. Sadly, it is really quite often those with disabilities have been considered as witches, warlocks, spirited, they needed exorcisms. These things have happened throughout history and are still happening today. Then the Renaissance, everyone loves the Renaissance. However, people with disabilities were ridiculed. You know, when you think of like the classic jester, when the king is like, dance for me, jester, you know, we think funny, you know, it's a comedian, it's the first kind of prankster. No, typically they were hunchback, typically they had disabled, and they were made to like dance and like move around for entertainment. People with disabilities were jokes. Not cool. Now on to 1700s. Disability was commonplace. Finally, people are starting to notice. This wasn't, you know, something which we kind of hid in the cupboard. People were allowed to come out, talk, interact, even get jobs. It doesn't mean they were accepted, though. It just means that it was something which people were speaking about. Oh, thanks for sending that, Amy. I'll take a look after. In the 1800s, they were unable to fend for themselves and were left to wander the streets. Homelessness skyrocketed during this time. Famine, poverty, it was widespread. And 9 times out of 10, a lot of the people on the streets did have a disability. If you weren't able to create a living, there was no social security or structure in place in order to support you. If you're lucky, there was be a bit of charity, but often you'd go to like sweatshops, or you'd be like, you wouldn't have the same rights as able-bodied people. The 20th century, we're getting a little bit modern now. People with disabilities were seen as objects or charities or welfare, or as needed to be the subject to medical treatments. Now, this is something which a lot of us can probably connect with. It's only fairly recently have we seen people with disabilities as differently abled. It's always been something that society have wanted to cure, wanted to get rid of. It's not something that we acknowledge it as a problem. That was seen as progressive. It's not now. There are a lot of people who are differently abled who are quite happy being who they are. They don't want to be cured. They don't want to be fixed. You know, that just wasn't where people's headspace was at this time in history. In 1907, so just over 100 years ago, the Immigration Act in the US happened. And this essentially meant if you had any disability or if you weren't able to earn a living, you are not allowed into the country. So many people who were disabled were disadvantaged. They had to leave their family. They weren't allowed to come along. They were very much segregated. In the 1930s, the rise of Hitler and the so-called master race. This is when when mass extermination of people with disabilities happened. Arguably, this was the worst time in history to be disabled. We often think about the Jews dying during the war. No, it was all minorities. It was anyone who wasn't seen as pure, as right, as able. In many ways, it's not that different from back when we were looking at ancient Greece. This was a bad time to be disabled. In the 1970, thankfully, the war's over. We moved on a bit. Local Education and Mentally Handicapped Act came into force. And handicap, that's another interesting word. What are all your views on it? I personally don't like the word handicapped. But if you speak to an American, and some of you might be from the US, people use that term all the time and they don't see any issue with it. So also, not just time periods, but also geographical areas can have different viewpoints on certain words. Community-based nursing. In 1974, essentially, we got rid of a lot of the hospitals and it was all done at home, which might have been seen as a positive, but it was a way of kind of cutting costs. Care in the community. Margaret Thatcher was rising to power. And it sounds nice. Oh, care in the community. That sounds nice. Not really, because we had lots of hospitals and they decided we need to get rid of the hospitals. So they shut down lots of hospitals and ultimately people had to fend for themselves. However, the movement has changed a lot in recent years. And now it's about having like more like personal things, about going to support groups, meeting people, but that wasn't its original intention. April says, the word handicapped was used quite a lot when I was a child. Nowadays, I don't use the word after I read it's a horrible word. Andrew says, handicapped is problematic as it translates to cap in hand, relates to people with disability as objects or charity. Oh, thanks, Andrew. I wonder why, though, a lot of Americans tend to still use the word. You know, again, I've only been to the US a handful of times, but from my experience, they use it very like fluidly without even a second thought. Some of the words don't mean the same things depending on the area of the world. That is also very, very true. So now we've had a look at a big kind of like overview of disability. I want to kind of like get in a little bit deeper. Disabled people were sent to the factories. In response to thousands of people being injured and returning from World War I, the population of disabled people was huge. Now, these people may have not been born disabled. They got it through life, but they needed support. You know, they needed to make money. We couldn't have a social net for everyone. So the Central Council for Care of Cripples was set up. Again, EACS, not a great word. However, that organization is still existing today, and it's called Disability Rights UK. I'm very familiar with that organization. They do great work, but it's interesting how like they have adapted and have changed over time. And 100 years really isn't that long, and yet so much has happened in that short time. We've got a lot of people in Pakistan are heavily uneducated because they don't have any money to go to school and they don't learn about different types of people within their society. I also understand from a lot of Asia, like I know India, maybe Pakistan, about the culture of class is a really big thing. And yeah, it sounds tough. Disparity is massive. Yes, the difference between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-not. Insulin-induced coma and convulsions was really common. This is when essentially when you purposely put someone in a coma in order to get rid of a mental health. Now, there are merits where this can work, but they were doing it willy-nilly. You know, it wasn't helpful. And they thought, okay, we can kind of take the mental illness out. And during this timeline, I am going to be like interweaving physical and mental together rather than separating them, because I think they do kind of go along a part of the journey, though have often been treated very different. It's not unsurprising that a lot of people with physical disabilities also have hidden disabilities, because mental health does take a bit of a knock if every day you're battling society. In the 30s, the Mental Health Act cropped up, and this was a big point because beforehand we had lunatic asylums, and they were essentially, you're mentally ill, you are wrong, you are evil, you are bad, let's lock you up. And then they changed it to mental hospitals, and they changed the approach somewhat, where actually, okay, you need to be supported, we need to look after you. Now, do not be mistaken. During the 30s, mental institutions were awful. People were locked up, they were chained, they were abused, but we were seeing a movement where people thought, you know what, this isn't right, we need to do something about it. In 35, we were having lobotomies. This is where people would literally stick things in the brain and try to do like electric therapy and try and kind of rewire the brain. Neurologists performed lobotomies to treat mental illness, which involved drilling holes in the patient's skulls to access the brains. This is still done sometimes, but definitely not like this. People did not know what they were doing. They saw a problem, they wanted to fix it, but they didn't really care about the ethical points. Andrew says the words have changed a lot in 40 years, and the concept of disability is still adapting, and I think it will still. I'm always interested to see, what do we use today which tomorrow's people think as offensive or insensitive or not right? What words are going to change? In 1939, the National Association for Mental Health was founded. This was the initial formation of what we now known as Mind. And this is, again, a big deal because this is when individuals were taking charge. They're like, well, the government, they're not doing anything. I'm going to make something. I'm going to use my found riches and wealth and put it back into, and the kind of concept of charity in the disability sphere was kind of growing. People just didn't do it back in the day. It was either your problem, as in your family, you look after it, but then they started growing. We go, oh, I just find it so sad. They need to make it mandatory in schools here in the UK to educate children on mental health. Unfortunately, mental health is so stigmatized, and we've come a long way in disability awareness, but mental health is still severely lacking. Or we've got, for instance, kids in schools calls others autistics, which is not the case, to insult them. Yeah, if every time you're being a bit socially awkward or distant, it is used. And though that is how these words, which aren't negative in the core essence, become negative over time. If you are continuously called autistic, obviously it's a bad word and it's going to be seen as such. Now in the 40s, and Churchill, though he was not an advocate for this by any means, by the way, did have mental health issues. So in his own words, he had depression, and he very famously described it as his black dog. And he believes that a lot of his successes were due to his disability, or which is really interesting. His kind of adversary allowed him to champion ahead. It gave him some sort of resilience. Now, Churchill was a really problematic character. In some breaths, he would act like the underdog who overcame all the odds, and at other times he would condemn other people. So I'm not kind of putting Churchill on a pedestal here, but it's noteworthy because he was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was a world leader, and yet he was public about his struggles in some of his memoirs. And this was something which influential people just did not speak about. There's a quote from the book Black Dog, and it has he been a stable and enabled man, he could have never inspired the nation. In 1940s, when all the odds were against Britain, a leader of sober judgment may not have concluded. What this is essentially saying is that part of his disability, or his unstableness, which again, a bit problematic, was part of the reason he was able to make these strong, rash decisions. Churchill was also physically disabled towards later life, hence the iconic walking stick we always see him pictured with. In the 1940s, the Disabled Persons Employment Act was passed. You'll notice this was quite similar to what happened after World War I. After the Second World War, we realised we've got a bit of a problem on our hand and we need to support people who otherwise aren't getting the same support they need. So this was setting up quota systems for large employers to hire people with disabilities as part of the workplace. This is another question I want to ask all of you. What do you think about quotas? We hire X amount of disabled people. We hire this amount of people who have autism. Are quotas a good thing or a bad thing? Is that positive discrimination, or is that something that we need to do in order to kickstart people seeing difference as beneficial? Honestly, it's a really tricky one. My personal view is I think quotas are useful in the short term, but in the long term, not something that we should rely on. But you tell me. Oh, April said a really interesting thing. She said there was a time when the word autistic couldn't appear in YouTube comments because the algorithm thought it was a bad word. Well, that speaks a lot for itself. We've got personally, I don't like, regarding to the quotas, we've got personally, I don't like them. I went for a job interview and I literally saw them re-advertising 3 times and I passed the interview. Or we got, I believe that quotas, aka affirmation action, is positive. Again, it depends. I mean, I guess I'm still deciding myself. I don't have a firm opinion on it. It's still something which it has to be the right person for the right job. But those right people aren't going to exist if we don't train them up. So it's a double-edged sword, and sometimes. Oh, Andrew says, it is a challenging issue, quotas. You can do weeks of research on the subject and find both positive and negative aspects of quotas. Thank you, you're very right. In 1946, this is when Mencap was formed. So we've already got Mind in place. We've got disability rights, and now Mencap. Mencap was is a really great organization. Originally, it was called the Association of Parents of Backward Children. Again, not a cool word. But are we condemning history? No, because history, what things meant back in the day, they have different meanings now. But what I like to see is that the movement, the organizations are developing and they are growing. So I don't think we should discard an organization because it has a checkered past, but commend them for developing and evolving over time. Mencap was formed by parents concerned about the lack of support to help them maintain children at home. I've worked lots with Mencap over the years, and the work they do is really great. It gives parents a break because supporting individuals with disabilities is challenging because there is no guidebook on how to support an individual because we are so different. The Mental Health Act. This was a big deal. And I know a lot of you aren't in the UK, but you'll notice the UK tends to be a bit like ahead of the curve when it comes to some of these policies, but typically most countries will follow suit either a bit before or a bit after, give or take. And this was an act to repeal the Lunacy and Mental Treatments Act and the Mental Deficiency Act. So what they typically do, they get all these acts and they think, yeah, I'm snip cut there, and they kind of re-amend it to make sure that people are treated fairly. Obviously, we know just because there's legislation doesn't mean that people are actually doing it, but it does mean at least there is movement, and in theory, you could sue someone if they went against it. But as most of us unfortunately may know, easier said than done. Discrimination is proving can be very, very challenging. On a bit more of a positive note now, 1948, the first ever Paralympic Games were held. This was coincided with the London Olympic Games. Interestingly, I'd love to know your thoughts again on this. With the Paralympics, good or bad? You know, because some things count like, okay, you're not disabled enough, you can't be in the Paralympics, or you're not able enough, you can't be in the regular Olympics. I don't know if that's just what you'd call it. For instance, dyspraxia, which I had, used to be in the Paralympics. It's no longer in the dyspraxia Olympics. However, if you have dyspraxia, the chance of you being selected for an athletic sports in the regular Olympics is quite diminished. So then you have this kind of grey spot where you're not one or the other. Oh, Amy says, I think that's an interesting question with regards to legislation that enforces rather than it is done proactively. Fantastic, but I also loved the Commonwealth Games this year. How did para events alongside regular events? How they did, yeah. I like to see when they're equal, and I like to see when they are actively promoted as equal competitions and sports. I think the London 2012 Olympics, which we're going to get onto shortly, is really pushed it forward. Andrew says, based on her knowledge, the disability history in Australia, UK and Australia, the history are similar. Yeah, they tend to be quite similar in terms of back and forth with like similar progression. In 1955 was another significant moment in the history of disability, because this is when the charity Leonard Cheshire, which again, great charity, funded a house, like a place to support people with physical disabilities in a developing country, India. Beforehand, you are lucky to get support in your own country, let alone it being considered something which would be for aid or for charity. This is when we are acknowledging that this happens all over. There is still much more work to do in certain countries, but this was like the starting point where other people who didn't have that direct connection started to take notice and starting to say, actually, we need to collectively work together around this. We got, would it be possible to have the Paralympics and the Olympics as one longer event? I think that's a nicer idea rather than separating them. The Olympics are already getting on quite long. For me, I don't think it's not the Paralympics. I still think there's a bit of tweaking to be done for it to send the right message. That's basically what they did with the Commonwealth Games. Yeah, I thought the Commonwealth Games did a really good job in that. That's a good example. 60s, closing down. Following an investigation into ill treatment, essentially people were abusing those who had severe mental health challenges and physical impairments. They got rid of a load of hospitals, which was kind of what the government wanted because they were expensive. The hospital plan cut mental illness beds from, they cut them a lot, essentially. And then we had a lot of people with mental illness, but there was nowhere for them to go. So what did we do? Well, that is when we didn't really do anything. And in the 70s, we decided these people need educating, okay? We can't just ignore them. And for the first time, education was mandatory in the UK for people who had disabilities. It was not required. You did not have to go to school. You were excused. Now everyone is entitled to education. Oh, Andrew says, no, we need to keep them separate. As a former Paralympic athlete, oh, nice. I feel proud of being involved in the movement and would not want them combined because disabled events would be reduced. Oh, that's a really interesting point, Andrew. Again, there's different arguments to either side, but that also makes a lot of sense. So I'm glad you were able to balance the debate. What sport did you do? In the 70s, the disability rights movement was birthed. This was when people were actively, rather than say being treated as the other or relying on handouts, it was being empowerment. If you were disabled, you had a voice and you wanted to be heard. So this was a really huge movement, and this was done across the world, mostly in Western countries, but it was a thing. Oh, Amy says, to Andrew's point, how do you feel about sports such as wheelchair rugby leagues, which are both able and disabled people to participate in the same team? Oh, interesting. I genuinely don't have a comment on that, but it's interesting. They're not as advertised, not as watched. Oh, athletics represented Australia in World Championship in UK. Oh, well, honestly, you did yourself proud. That sounds amazing. Now for the 80s, and I've been waiting for this one because it's interesting. Margaret Thatcher, very, very polarizing in the UK. Was she a goodie? Was she a baddie? Well, essentially, she intentionally underfunded hospitals and services in order for them to fail, for them to get shut down. I know this is controversial, but there's lots of evidence and proof surrounding it. So essentially, she set it up for failure in order to save money in the long run. And then she kind of created the healthcare in the community, which we'll talk about in a minute. But just a quick kind of rule of thumb. Is Thatcher, was she overall good? Was she the stern leader Britain needed at the time? Or was she harmful and screwed everything up? Okay, we've got 100% says harm. Most people would agree that, depending on what class you came from. Able people from high-income families thought she was great. People from lower economic backgrounds really struggled, and her legacy has continued to this day. In 83, we have the Representation of Peoples Act. People were actually allowed to vote. Mental illness and learning disability hospitals can actually get a say. Before then, you were basically considered a criminal. After countless protests and campaigning by people with disabilities, the Watershed Disability Discrimination was passed, making it illegal to discriminate people against disability. So this, again, was kind of like the initial act before the Equality Act 2010. In 2006, we had a massive housing crisis where people just were too unwell to remain in their own homes, but there just wasn't housing available. So people who had learning impairments got further and further away. 2010, this is when we come up to the landmark legislation of the Equality Act. This was a really big deal and is still a big deal. And like I said, a lot of countries have their own equivalents. Now we're back to the Olympics, okay? 2012. I actually worked in the Olympics 2012. What a game. And though we had had Paralympics before, this one was special because it was heavily marketed, it was advertised, it was on TV, and the way they advertised it and shown it, these individuals are strong, they are powerful, they are equal. I actually thought this was a real turning point in how it was represented. But I'd love to know your views, particularly Andrew. Did you think the 2012s was a turning point, or was there another one which you think kind of put it on a similar stage? Australia beat UK in the Disability Discrimination Act. Oh man, you beat us. Well, good on Australia. I don't care who beats who, as long as it happens. Until very recently, employees in the US and Canada with intellectual disabilities were paid below minimum wage. Again, when you think about it now, you think, how could that possibly have happened? And yet the history is not old at all. Moving on to present day, we are developing a lot. And I think the biggest change at the moment is ability first. It's about saying what people can do rather than what people can't do. One of my biggest issues with the word disability is it focuses so much on the negative aspect rather than seeing someone as a full-fledged human being who has both strengths and weaknesses. I still don't know the best name for it, but I do think we are moving to a place which values difference and supports challenges rather than focusing just on the challenges. Oh, Andrew says, I love the 2012 Paralympics. The media campaign was one of the best I had seen. Yeah, I worked on the broadcasting team, and I must say it was done fantastically. So that is a very, very brief history and overview of disability, both hidden and physical. Now, I just want to quickly shout out to those who are in the UK, because if you are in the UK, there is a government grant, which is called Access to Work, which means you can get support in the workplace for free, no matter what your disability, and you don't even need proof. If you're in work and feel that support of any either equipment, assistive staff, coaching would be beneficial, do get in touch. If you're not in the UK, unfortunately, that grant isn't available to you, but as an organization, we do support people worldwide, so we might be able to support you. We don't have as much resources to do so, but we definitely still want to be there. So do get in contact if you think you can work with us, or we might be able to support you. Any last questions or comments before we wrap up for the day? Oh, before the end, we've got a question. I'd like to know how I can organize a foundation in Canada and the US for dyspraxia. How do you start your own movement? That's a really good question. For me, it starts off as a social action campaign. It's just about doing something good in the community, getting recognition, getting backers behind, then looking for grants that are available for community projects. Then you might want to start registering it as a CIC, as a B Corp. And then from there, you might want to consider, do I want to make the move to charity? It's something that you've kind of got to build up. But the most important thing when it comes to creating a movement is credibility. So, think very carefully about how you want to position yourself and what your end goals are. Oh, we've got, how can I get in contact with you to volunteer? Well, if you go on our website, we used to have a volunteer section, but I think we took it down because we had a lot of interest. But if you just email our general admin at Exceptional Individuals or Nat at Exceptional Individuals, we can take it by case. So as I did mention, we do have lots and lots of webinars we do every week. So do check out our YouTube channel and you can learn everything. If you enjoyed today, we've got the history of hidden disabilities. We've also got a controversial history of Hans Asperger's. We've got some really interesting ones which take this subject and go even deeper. We've also got Facebook groups where you can kind of get involved, share thoughts and opinions, resources. Can we connect to your organization in the UK? Absolutely. We're always looking for partners. One organization alone can't change the system, but collectively we can. And lastly, we also have a LinkedIn channel. If you're professional, if you're looking for a job, if you want to find high employment that actually values difference, do have a look at that. Here's our details. If you have any questions, just drop an email at admin@accept.co.uk, or if you want to contact me directly, it's nat@accept.co.uk. If you're in the UK, you can drop us a phone call or go on our website and we'll take it from there. I really hope you enjoyed today. It's been absolutely great having everyone here. Thank you so much for being so interactive and sharing your comments. And we've got one more webinar next week. It is autism in the education system before we wrap up for the year. So do check that out. Bye, everyone. And thank you so much for attending, and hopefully see you at future sessions.